Okay, gentlemen, I've been asked to rehash, review some material from early part of 1800s, particularly the era of Andrew Jackson. So I'm going to try to do this as quickly and as efficiently as possible. Here you go. Key thing to know about the Jackson era is that it is the rise of mass democracy. What makes the Jackson era significant is a shift that is taking place. Before Jackson, the framers of the Constitution had assumed that decision-making should be kept out of the hands of the folk in the streets. We've talked about this a bit in class. The framers understood that a republic needed to be responsible to its citizens, and therefore officials should be, in some sense, elected. But they also understood that the danger of democracy was mobocracy, where the crowd was making decisions based on its moods, its fears, its biases, and where they could easily be manipulated by powerful or charismatic figures. Therefore, all through the Constitution, we have all these buffers to keep direct decision-making out of the hands of the people, while still making the government responsible to the people. So the Electoral College is created, where the choice of president was in the hands of this council of what was supposed to be the wisest and most experienced people from each state. Although it doesn't say this in the Constitution, most states chose their electors for president until the 1820s through the state legislature. So your state government would decide who was going to sit in that electoral college, and then the electoral college would figure out who would make a good president. In the earliest days, when the framers did not anticipate there would be candidates for president or political parties as we understand it, these electors would simply be this committee of statesmen who would choose the chief executive. The framers also wanted the Senate to be chosen by the state legislatures. So as we know, until the 17th Amendment and that progressive era in the early 1900s, senators were chosen by the state legislatures. The House of Representatives was directly elected by the people. But in order to vote in just about every state, you needed to own a certain amount of property. Therefore, it was only adult white male citizens who had some business because a dollar value was the equivalent of property, or who owned some land, and therefore were thought to be solid citizens with an investment in the community, could vote. And the decisions of government were made by Congress, never directly by the people. So the government was responsible to the people, but direct decision-making was kept out of the hands of the crowd in the street, who, after all, weren't experts in economics, foreign affairs, the law, and so the job was, they thought, to entrust that process to those people whom the crowd in the street did trust to make those decisions on their behalf. In the 1820s, that all begins to change. Property requirements start to be dropped, and states begin to shift toward direct election of electors for president. And that inevitably alters the politics of the moment. So, notice economic problems and conflict over the slavery issue led to a greater interest in politics in the 1820s and 1830s. We know that era of good feelings that gets you in the period just after the War of 1812, everybody's feeling very patriotic. The country is sort of united in one big political ball. There's not really division between parties. Well, that starts to break down in the 1820s. Why? As the economy goes through rough patches, groups start to turn on each other. The working class starts to turn on the wealthy. City dwellers and farmers are having problems with each other. And the slavery issue continues to be a problem in the country, economically and politically. Strong political parties therefore begin to reemerge. The Democrats become, this is the old Jeffersonian Democrats, the Democratic Republicans as they were known, become the National Democrats, or the Jacksonian Democrats. The Democratic Republican Party splits, and the Whig Party emerges from it. The Jacksonian Democrats are all about the little guy, farmers particularly. They are based south and west largely, and among some of the poorer classes in the city. The Whig Party is all about business, and where the Jacksonian Democrats see government should stay out of the lives of farmers and working people, the Whig Party wants a strong government because they need that infrastructure of law to promote business. Very close to the old Hamiltonians. So the Whig Party would be the continuation of those Hamiltonian ideas. A national bank to provide a kind of financial infrastructure to make business easy. Use of the federal government's power to create roads, canals. We're not quite at railroads yet, but that sort of thing. And a tariff to protect American business from competition abroad. That's all very Hamilton, that's Whig. Jefferson's Democrats, the old Democratic Republicans, which are now becoming the Jacksonian Democrats, they're all about small government. They fear the power of big banks. Farmers are always suspicious of that. They fear the power of government because they see it in the hands of business. So that's going to be the setup. The Jacksonian Democrats, as they're called, or simply the Democrats, versus the Whigs. New forms of campaigning start to be used. If you're no longer just appealing to a handful of guys in a state legislature, you have to appeal to the crowd in the street. Now you have to invent mass campaigns, advertising, free food, free liquor, campaign slogans and songs, image making, right? You've got to motivate those folks in the street, the average guy, to show up and vote for you. This all led to a very high rate of political participation. About 78% of eligible voters voted, let's say, in the 1840 election, which is post-Jackson era, but you get the idea. 78%. In a modern presidential election, a heavy, heavy turnout is around 55, 56%. Let's remember, though, that's 78% of adult white males, although by now we've dropped that property requirement. Okay, so we have this event called the Corrupt Bargain of 1824. What happens? There are 4 candidates in the election of 1824. Why 4? Because the system of parties we just talked about, Democrats and Whigs, has still not sort of settled down. It hasn't congealed yet. So you have a lot of guys out there that are running for president. John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams, was from Massachusetts. Henry Clay of Kentucky. William Crawford of Georgia. Andrew Jackson of Tennessee. All 4 campaigned as what were called Republicans, although that word Republican had nothing to do with the Republican Party of the Civil War and after that. The Federalist Party had dissolved. We weren't quite congealing into Democrats and Whigs yet, so everybody was just kind of candidate for president. And as you might expect, with John Quincy Adams from New England, Clay from the West in Kentucky, and two guys from the South, Jackson and Crawford, you get this sort of 3.5-way split, and nobody winds up as the overall dominant candidate. Jackson had the most popular appeal. He was a war hero from the War of 1812. As we remember, he fought the Battle of New Orleans, famously winning it 2 weeks after the war had ended. He campaigned against government corruption and privilege. So his shtick is he's representing the little guy. He's representing the small farmer, the working man, against the big New England powers, or Henry Clay, who was always on the side of business. Jackson wound up winning the popular vote, but not by enough. What there was of a popular vote didn't necessarily determine the outcome of the election very much in that time. You needed a majority, 131 electoral votes. He only got 99 of them, which is a lot, but it's not a majority. So this is what the vote looked like at the time. So you're beginning to get some popular voting, and so you get these splits going on here. Crawford took his home state of Georgia and Virginia. Virginia's 24, that's a big chunk of votes in those days. Jackson got the South, the rest of the South, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, and part of Louisiana. The Florida Territory wasn't a state yet. Arkansas wasn't a state yet. Michigan, the Michigan Territory wasn't a state yet. So they're not voting. Missouri, Kentucky, Ohio. Missouri, we remember from the Missouri Compromise, is now a state. They all go for Clay. He's the Ohio, Kentucky kind of guy. He's all about, for instance, building canals. Ohio, with that lake up there, has now become interested in building canals to connect it to the Ohio River. But Jackson also takes Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Indiana, and part of Illinois. Adams gets New England up here. Upstate New York would be considered part of New England. And he gets New Orleans, which is a city full of traders dependent on tariffs, and part of Illinois. So you see there's a very regional split. Jackson can say, well, he's got support in the South, he's got support in the middle states, the old middle colonies, he's got some support in the West. Adams is only a New Englander. Okay, and as we see, by the way, too, about 43% of the popular vote, such as there was, notice, by the way, that popular vote, 356,000. That's about 2/3 of the population of just Staten Island today. He gets 38% of the electoral vote. Because this New England area is small in area, but heavy in population, John Quincy Adams gets 32% to Jackson's 38%. And you got the split between the other guys, which is what really kind of screws everything up. Okay, so what do? Adams winds up winning. How? Since no candidate got a majority of the electoral votes, you need a majority to win, the whole race goes to the House of Representatives. Nowadays, because we only have two major presidential candidates, you always wind up with somebody getting a majority. But in those days, if you got a four-way split, you wind up in this situation. House of Representatives has to choose among the top three candidates. It's in the 12th Amendment. Well, Henry Clay was eliminated because he was number 4. But he was still Speaker of the House of Representatives and the leader of the Whigs there. So, you know, he's got a lot of influence in that House of Representatives. And because he has a chunk of votes behind him, he can kind of throw that political weight around. So what does he do? He looks at this situation and says, John Quincy Adams is tough to get along with, but I can get along with him. Andrew Jackson he saw as a sociopath, as a crazy man, as a dangerous guy. So Crawford is not even considered. He was a distant third, and he was sick at the time. That's done. So you're down to John Quincy Adams and Jackson. Henry Clay looks at Jackson and says, I hate this guy. I don't like the fact he's got support in the West, which is my territory. Jackson and Clay had also gotten into beef because Clay had gone after Jackson for that Seminole War. You remember the Seminole War in Florida. Clay had thought that Jackson was way out of bounds in invading down there. And he said, if this is the kind of guy this guy is, he's going to be dangerous as president. So Clay throws his support to Adams. He's not personal friends with Adams. John Quincy Adams was a very difficult man to get along with personally. But they supported that Henry Clay American system, which is that descendant of Hamilton, right? Using the federal government for a protective tariff, a national bank, and building infrastructure, roads and canals. So he says, well, I can get along with Adams. We kind of agree. So he throws his support to him. All right. Not particularly surprising. Adams gets elected in the House of Representatives on the first ballot thanks to Clay. Now he's president. A few days later, Adams announces he's appointing Clay as Secretary of State, the most important position in the cabinet. Important post. 3 of the 4 previous presidents had been secretaries of state. So it's a path to the presidency. Jackson says Adams bribed Clay with a promise of this office, and this was the corrupt bargain. Question: was it a corrupt bargain? Most historians think not. Henry Clay was actually a kind of obvious choice for Secretary of State. Once again, it's a key post. Clay had a lot of experience in government. He and Adams were on the same page politically. If Adams had been elected president outright, without going to the House, there's every chance he would have asked Clay to be a Secretary of State anyway. So there's no real evidence that there was any bribery here. But Jackson, who can't believe that he would lose an election and couldn't believe that he had actually lost, and I don't mean he was surprised, I mean he could not grasp in his head that there was such a thing as him losing an election, assumed therefore it must be the result of corruption. So Adams becomes president, but he's got Jackson running around the country screaming about corruption for his whole presidency. The effects of the corrupt bargain. Well, as I said, there's no positive evidence of an actual deal. Adams was personally a real pain in the neck to get along with, but was incredibly scrupulously honest. Didn't deal in patronage being giving out offices and jobs for your support. And even if there was a bargain, which we have no evidence of, making a deal is part of being a politician. That's not quite the same thing as bribery. However, what this does do is it ticks a lot of people in the country off. People were not willing to accept selecting a president without substantial public input. Unlike previous elections, where electors had chosen the president and the state legislature had chosen electors, people now say the system is rotten, we want to elect guys directly, and we don't want it to wind up in the House of Representatives. Adams' personality in the White House, and this is all important for Jackson, cold, irritable, he's got a kind of nasty mouth on him, he does not make friends. He was a brilliant Secretary of State. He had been Secretary of State under Monroe. Remember the Monroe Doctrine? He was a good lawyer and actually a brilliant negotiator. But as president, he couldn't get members of Congress to like him, couldn't get popular support. And Adams was kind of stuck in his father's day. John Adams had become president, of course, and he had been president because of his ability. It was sort of generally conceded, even by Jefferson, who was, John Adams' big rival in the Continental Congress back in the day. Even Jefferson admitted that Jefferson would have thought he himself was the most talented man in the 13 colonies and the new United States, but he admitted that John Adams was second only to him. Now, it wasn't good enough just to be a brilliant thinker like John Adams, a brilliant lawyer like John Adams, a guy who had been there as part of the Declaration of Independence. Now you needed political skills. You needed to be a marketable candidate. And Adams just wasn't that. He lost many supporters because he would not fire political opponents that did their job well to make room for his supporters. People wanted him to sweep out all the employees of the federal government and replace them with John Quincy Adams, campaign workers. And he said that's irresponsible of a president to do. If somebody is doing their job well and properly, that's what the taxpayers are paying for. I don't care that they are of, another party or they voted for somebody else. Okay, but then his supporters start to say, well, if we're not getting anything out of it, why are we working for him? John Adams has more problems than that. He was a nationalist, not in the modern sense. There are two ways to use that word, nationalism. One way is that the United States is the bestest country out there. The other way, and this is Adams's way, is to put the interest of the whole country, the country as a whole, above the interests of your region. That's conflicting with politics in the 1820s. The trend was more towards states' rights, individual states getting to govern themselves more and more, and sectionalism. That is, the New England seeing itself as different from the South, seeing itself as different from the West. Those states' rights and sectionalism were being driven by differences in the economy. The South is increasingly becoming a cotton-only economy. The West is becoming increasingly grain-growing farmers, and the Northeast is becoming manufacturing, business, and trade. So individual states say, we don't want a national government run by the other two sections telling us how to run our state because they don't understand our economy. The other thing that is driving sectionalism is, of course, and always, slavery. And that's becoming a bigger and bigger issue, more and more entrenched, and they don't want a national government that's strong, because if that national government goes, quote, the wrong way on slavery, however you're defining that, that's going to stomp on local rights. So Adams was about doing things like proposing construction of roads and canals to connect the different parts of the country. He wanted to build a national astronomical observatory and a national university to promote America as a place of brilliance and education. Well, if you're the working class in New York, or you're a corn farmer in Illinois, you look at that as a colossal waste of money. Why do I want to send my kid off to school to look at the stars? So all of this was opposed by many, especially the South, as a waste of public money. They also feared that this would wind up in a national government trying to interfere with their slavery on which their economy is based. Okay, let me point out too, this, I'm just going to do this very quickly. The key thing here is the Cherokee people were in Georgia. That was their ancient ancestral homeland by the coast in Georgia. Whites in Georgia wanted the Cherokees out because they happened to be sitting on some really good farmland. And as long as they were there, the white Georgians couldn't get their hands on it. They wanted the federal government to push the Cherokees out. And the governor of Georgia threatened to do it himself. Adams believed that that was immoral. Not so much because he loved Indians, but because as a lawyer, he saw the law as the most important thing. Therefore, he wanted to apply contract law and treaty law with the Cherokees. They should be dealt with with the same sort of honesty and law as if you were dealing business to business. So it wasn't so much he was a great lover of Cherokee human rights, as much as he was an adherent of the rule of law. I will say this, though, and it's worth knowing. John Quincy Adams was a believer in general, human rights. He was a screaming abolitionist and later on became the key lawyer in a case called the Amistad Case. The Amistad was a ship where the slaves actually got out of their chains and rebelled. They were captured and put on trial in the United States. And Adams went to bat for them, saying because the slave trade by then was illegal, it was also illegal, therefore, to return them to their alleged owners. And he argued the case in front of the Supreme Court. So he was a man with kind of the beginnings of this moral sense of humanity. But he got into a fight with Georgia over this, and as you can imagine, this did not make him popular with Southerners, where you still had significant numbers of Native Americans. Okay, 1828 therefore comes along. Adams is up for re-election. Jackson is going to come back with a vengeance. So, the Republican Party, such as it was, we talked about it, wasn't really a party, and it doesn't mean Republican as we think of it, splits into two groups. Adams's people, that are called the National Republicans, they're really Whigs. And Jackson's people, called the Democrat Republicans, they're really Democrats. So think of Adams as a Whig and Jackson as a Democrat Republican, or Democrat. Campaign of 1828, the Democrats of Jackson present Jackson as a frontier man and a commoner. He's just a guy like you, out there, building his farm out on the edge of the wilderness. In reality, he was one of the wealthiest plantation owners in America and had a massive number of slaves. So, the idea that this guy was just an average Joe, which is how they try to portray him, is laughable. He was a super wealthy guy. He attacks Adams as a corrupt aristocrat. Well, first of all, Adams was not corrupt. In fact, in some ways, he was so honest that he wouldn't make compromises, he wouldn't cut corners, and it made it hard for him politically. He was aristocratic in his sort of manner, but he was not nearly as wealthy as Jackson was. So you get this mudslinging. Jackson goes after John Quincy Adams. Why? He cites the fact there are chessboards in the White House. Yeah, which he says are, Adams has turned the White House into a gambling house and a palace. He attacked Adams for his salary. He accused Adams, based on absolutely nothing, this he completely made up, that he had given to the Tsar of Russia an American girl as a prostitute. That's a true story, and it never happened, but Jackson completely made it up. On the other hand, although Adams refused to get involved, some of his supporters spread the rumor that Jackson's mother was a hooker, that his wife had cheated on him, and which also was not really true, and called Jackson a murderer for his duels and brawls. That's actually true. Andrew Jackson had a history of getting involved in duels. So, that was you could make a legitimate charge on that one. But you can see, instead of these guys arguing about issues and philosophy, it's really very modern campaigning of finger pointing. So you get things like this. Some account of the bloody deeds of General Jackson, and they go through all the guys that he had killed in duels, that they claimed he had killed in bar fights. Results of the election 1928. South and West again went heavily for Jackson. The northern states and the middle states, instead of going for Adams, now split. And the lower classes, especially in cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, went for Jackson. So in this case, you've got a two-man race. Adams has made himself unpopular. Jackson is campaigning in a very modern kind of way. Jackson wins the electoral vote, 178 to 83. That's, a clear victory. And it shows the shifting of power. The western states now are becoming, we see here, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio's got 16 electoral votes. Kentucky's got 14 electoral votes. That's a lot in this setup here. And you see, Jackson now solidly has the South, solidly has the West, what we will call the Midwest, and is making enough of a dent in the Northeast that Adams is cooked. Jackson's nickname is Old Hickory, and his personality is something. He's a tall guy, skinny, struggled with all sorts of illnesses, which may have led to him being irritable. He had picked up malaria in the swamps of New Orleans, I believe. Malaria gives you recurrent fever, so every few days you get sick again. He had tuberculosis, which eats up your lungs. He had chronic dysentery, and the duels had left a couple of bullets in him, so that they were slowly leaching lead. And in addition to lead poisoning, interfering with kids' intellectual development, it can harm their brains. It also tends to give you stomach problems, digestive problems. So the guy was kind of a medical mess, and that made him kind of cranky. Jackson's real life background: he had been born in the South, orphaned by parents at an early age, and so kind of grew up a bit wild. Little education. He was barely literate. But in those days, you didn't have to be. He wound up becoming a judge out in Tennessee, even though he knew nothing about the law and could barely read, and had been a congressman. We know, of course, we'll take this. He and Washington both had little education, although Washington always felt bad about that. rose from the masses but did not share much with them. He was a frontiersman in a way. He did come from the lower classes. But his mansion, called the Hermitage, and his slave plantation set him apart from the poor. He did, however, share their prejudices. Jackson was an out-and-out, complete, total racist. He looked at Indians as savages. He looked at his black slaves as little more than animals, and he also hated them elites, what he saw as the educated money classes of the big cities on the East Coast. They were the big enemy. Jackson's inauguration, when they swear him in as president, was quite an event. He opened up the White House to everybody, and the crowd went crazy. They wound up getting them boozed up to calm them down. Okay, I'm going to move through here. Big thing to know about Jackson is the spoils system, just the opposite of John Quincy Adams. To the victor belong the spoils of the enemy. So, this was before this time, the spoils system didn't mean this. It meant in wartime, when you conquered an enemy, you got to take his stuff. Back from ancient times, you got to take his weapons, you got to take his whatever he had on him. So now, Jackson applies this to politics. If I'm president, now all of those jobs in the federal government are mine to give out as rewards to my friends. He introduces the spoils system on a wide scale, under this kind of belief that any good American was good enough to do a government job. He didn't have an education, he could barely read, so anybody could do, a job as long as they were a true blue American. And what defined you as a real true American? You voted for Jackson. That proved it. He also did not want to encourage a class of bureaucrats, that is a kind of permanent group of people who were experts in their government jobs and became a kind of permanent workforce. He saw that as in the danger of becoming its own kind of aristocracy in the country. So what's the change here? When Washington takes over as president, going back to Washington, he needed new people in positions. He's making it all up for the first time. He's inventing a government. So he's pulling in all kinds of people who had, never worked in a government before because we didn't have one. Okay, great. Once Washington leaves office, now we have John Adams, the original, comes in as the second president. He doesn't fire all of Washington's guys. He keeps them on. And so, since 1800 till the 1828 election, you had not had widespread firing of officials. Jackson is the first guy to do this. And the whole purpose of it is to pay off those people who had worked in that campaign for him. So you had men openly buying positions. If you gave money to the Jackson campaign, you were guaranteed a job. People who couldn't read or who were just generally incompetent were given jobs. So you had guys who were made clerks, record keepers for the federal government who couldn't read the pieces of paper in their hand. You had open crooks being given jobs. A cat named Samuel Swartout stole $1 million in a time when $1 million was probably more like 50 million today, and took off to England. Like you had crooks and crumbs coming into the government. However, the spoils system became important for building this two-party system. People would be loyal to a party for jobs. So it was more about that now, which party you choose. Your influence network than anything else. Okay. During his time as president, you get this tricky Tariff of Abominations. That's what it was called. So you got this tariff that protected U.S. industry from competition from Europe. But therefore, if you're taxing stuff, it drove up the prices Americans had to pay, even for domestically produced goods, since there was less competition. So if you have a chair made in England, right, and the English chair they're selling in America for $10, the American chair they're selling for $11 because our industry is less efficient. We're an infant country. So you put a $10 tax on the British chair. Now that chair is going to cost $20. Okay. But it means that the Americans don't have to figure out a way to drop their price. So whether you're buying the American chair for 11 or 12 or $13 now, or the British chair for $20, you're paying more than you really have to. So it's driving prices up for consumers. Are more people likely to buy that cheaper American chair? Yeah, it helps that American factory, but the consumer is still getting screwed. If you're a farmer, not only are you buying this stuff and therefore paying more, but you're trying to sell your cotton or wheat in Europe. If we're putting a tax on imports from England, what is England going to do? They're going to put a tax on American stuff, which is going to hurt the farmers. Farmers, therefore, hated that Tariff of Abominations. They're the ones who call it that. If you were a factory worker, you may not be thrilled that you're paying a little more for American goods than you should, but at least you still have a job because you're making it to sell to other people. The farmers were the ones who really hated that tariff. So middle and New England states, where you have factories, making things that are competing with imports, they like the tariff. The South, which is mostly farmers, hate the tariff. 1824, that tariff increased significantly. This is under Adams. 1828, this is during the presidential election. They raise the tariff again. Why? Because they think it's going to embarrass Adams. But when Jackson wins, now Jackson is stuck with that tariff. And what does he do? If he lowers it, he's hurting business. If he doesn't lower it, he's hurting himself with the farmers. Believing that the South was the most hurt by the tariff, we see the North experienced a boom in manufacturing. West was busy selling land, so they didn't care. The South was hurting because farmers couldn't compete in the world. Southern concerns over slavery caused strong response to the tariff. Why? The stronger that federal government is in doing things like imposing tariffs, the more likely it was that they might interfere with slavery. This is part of what's behind the debate on the Missouri Compromise. Northerners are starting to get more and more skeptical about slavery. 1822, you had a slave rebellion led by a guy named Denmark Vesey. Slave rebellions scare the living daylights. That slave rebellion is put down pretty brutally, but boy, did it terrify the South. And Britain had just abolished slavery, so there was strong international pressure against slavery. The South thought if we stand up to the tariff, which isn't really related to slavery, it would show that Southern states would not allow the federal government to push them around. So, South Carolina tries this thing called nullification. John C. Calhoun, who is the great member of Congress from South Carolina, pushes for this. He argued that the Tariff of 1828 was unconstitutional, and therefore he called for southern states to nullify the tariff. That is to say, we don't care what the federal government says. In South Carolina, we are not going to enforce the tariff. You remember the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions? That back in 1798 was about the Alien and Sedition Act. Kentucky and Virginia, led by Jefferson and Madison, had said the Alien and Sedition Act was unconstitutional, so in Kentucky and Virginia, we are going to ignore the law, right? Well, they're trying the same logic. The problem is, in both cases, the logic doesn't work. A state cannot undo a national law. Constitution doesn't permit it. What's really embarrassing is John C. Calhoun is behind this. He's Jackson's own vice president. So he's fighting Jackson on this. He's putting Jackson in the position where he's backing him into a corner. So the Nullies, as they were known in South Carolina, try to nullify this tariff. 1832, this is toward the end of Jackson's presidency, they pass a new tariff. It adjusts that Tariff of Abominations, but not enough. The Southerners are still not satisfied. So, in 1832, they threatened to secede. It's going to come back again, right, in South Carolina? If the federal government tried to enforce the tariff in South Carolina. And I won't even go into the statistical thing here. I'll leave this up, but you can see it if you want. Okay. Jackson sort of would have been sympathetic, but he'll be damned if he's going to have a state tell him how to run his presidency. So he threatens to send the military into South Carolina and hang all of the nullifiers. This leads to a big open conflict. Henry Clay, Jackson's enemy, now steps in and didn't want Jackson to get the credit for having stood up to the South Carolinians, so he proposes a compromise tariff. You don't have to know all the details here, but basically Henry Clay takes the credit for coming up with a compromise to keep everybody happy. And it's passed with a lot of argument, but it gets passed. The force bill, that is the authorization to enforce that tariff, key. Why? Because it asserts the federal government is supreme. So you remember the Declaratory Act before the American Revolution? The British back off of the Stamp Act, but passed the Declaratory Act saying they could put the Stamp Act in if they want to, and it was perfectly legal, but they're choosing not to do it anymore. Well, this is kind of the same thing. Henry Clay's compromise says we are going to back off of that tariff of 1828, but we don't have to. The federal government is supreme and a state cannot nullify it. Okay, so just briefly, South Carolina goes along with this in the end. But you can see the hints of civil war coming. Henry Clay wound up a hero for saving the Union, preventing civil war. But that issue of states' rights versus federal supremacy, where slavery is in the background, is going to come up again. Okay, let's talk briefly about Trail of Tears under Jackson. Remember, John Adams had said to Georgia, leave the Indians alone. Okay. Well, we're back to that problem. The Cherokee are in Georgia. They want that land. The federal government's policy had been to take land only by treaty. So we would negotiate with the Indians, we would pay them, we would make a treaty. That was the idea. And move Indians out so that white settlers could have the land, but we were going to do it all legally and, as was thought at the time, by some definition of the word, fairly. And it was about trying to civilize the Indians, turn them into Christians, promote literacy and education for them. That's going to fix it all. Okay. 1825, by the time you get to the 1820s, there's still about 125,000 Indians east of the Mississippi. How many is that? Well, if you remember, the elections of that time, you had about 350,000 adult white males voting. That's 75% turnout. So you can figure you had maybe 450,000 adult white males, 125,000 Indians. That's a lot, right, as a percentage. Cherokees in Georgia worked to accommodate themselves to whites. If you had gone into the areas of Georgia that were Cherokee, it would have looked pretty similar to all the other areas. They lived the same way the white people did. They adopted farming and private property ideas. They had schools. They even had their own written alphabet that they invented, and there were plantations where there were Native Americans who actually owned slaves. So they're becoming very Georgian. 1828, Georgia claims to have control over the Cherokee and essentially negates their existence as a tribe. Cases go to the Supreme Court. Know them. The key case is Webster v. Georgia. Worcester. Looks like Worcester. Worcester v. Georgia, where the Indians sue and say, under the Constitution, only the federal government can make treaties with the Indians. The states cannot touch the Indians. They have to treat us as though we are an independent country. The Supreme Court 3 times upholds the rights of the Indians. Jackson's attitude is to refuse to recognize them. Famously, he says, John Marshall has made his decision. Now let's see him try to enforce it. Well, it's the president's job to enforce decisions of the Supreme Court, but because he doesn't like it, he's just going to ignore it. Jackson decides he's going to come up with a solution. He proposes removal of the Indians from Georgia. By that he means, instead of just shoving them off the land or taking it away, we're going to give them alternate land. We're going to give them a big chunk of territory outside of Georgia and give them the opportunity to move there and start over again, where he says, I'm doing you a favor. The whites in Georgia are never going to accept you. They're never going to give you a fair break. So by giving you this land, you can start over there. It was supposed to be voluntary, but in fact it was enforced. And 100,000 Indians, mostly Cherokees, but also Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Seminoles, get shoved. Where? The Indian Removal Act of 1830 sent them to the Indian Territory, which later became the state of Oklahoma, where in theory they were supposed to be permanently free from whites. Instead, they were given the territory, and within 15 years, the government was selling land now to white settlers in Oklahoma. So we see here a quick look at what's going on. So this area here is now Oklahoma, the Indian Territory. You had Indians from all over move out to these territories, but the number of Iroquois that are left, the number of Ottawa that are left are pretty small. The big groups are the Cherokee in Georgia, the Creek, Chickasaw, and Choctaw. And the Trail of Tears is the trail that goes really from Cherokee Territory in Georgia out to Oklahoma. Okay. The Sauk and Fox Indians, this is one of the smaller tribes, led by Black Hawk, resisted, but were crushed. The Seminole Indians in Florida continued to fight, were crushed. So Jackson had no sympathy really for these Indians. They were just in the way. All right, now the bank war. Jackson hated big monopolistic businesses, like the Bank of the United States, as did his supporters. Remember, his supporters are little guys and farmers. Banks are the enemy. Banks had much control over the economy. They issued paper money, but the value of that money changed based on the health of the bank and the amount of paper money issued. Governments made money using gold and silver coins. Banks issuing paper money are claiming to have that paper backed by gold and silver coins they owned. But that money was only worth something if you trusted the bank. And the more of that paper money they issued, the easier it was to get, the less valuable it was, the more you had inflation. The Bank of the United States had been started, we know, under Hamilton, become an important part of the economy, acted almost like a branch of government. It was the principal holder of government deposits, controlled much of the U.S.'s gold and silver, and its paper money was very stable in value. Other banks depended on that Bank of the United States for the stability of the financial system, which of course was key for business. Although the Bank of the United States functioned like a branch of the government, it was technically a private institution, not accountable to the people. So its president, Nicholas Biddle, held a huge amount of power, and there was a question about its constitutionality. The Constitution does not say anything about a national bank. It does give Congress the power to regulate the value of money, and the elastic clause gives Congress the power to do all necessary and proper things to put that into effect. It had long been held that the national bank was part of that necessary and proper implied power. But that was very controversial. And some believed that that bank itself went against U.S. ideas about equality and democracy, had too much control over the economy, and farmers, again, we've talked about 100 times, hated these banks. 1832, Daniel Webster and Henry Clay, Whig, get a recharter bill for the Bank of the U.S. through Congress. It's going to expire in 1836. So under Jackson, they decide to go for rechartering, that is, extending the bank. If Jackson signed the bill authorizing the new charter for the bank, he'd lose his supporters in the South and the West, all those farmers. If, on the other hand, he vetoed the bill for the bank, he'd lose all of the Easterners and slam himself with the business crowd, who was, after all, the backbone of the economy. Clay didn't plan on the fact that these powerful Easterners were a political minority and that they were afraid of Jackson. Jackson goes ahead and vetoes the bank bill. This is key. Presidents have the power to veto bills of Congress. So for something to become law, both houses of Congress must pass it by majority vote. President signs it. If the president vetoes it, goes back to Congress, and if it is repassed by 2/3 vote, it becomes a law anyway. Until Jackson, presidents had rarely vetoed laws and had based their veto on their belief that a particular law was unconstitutional. The bank had been found to be constitutional, McCulloch v. Maryland. We have talked about that case. However, Jackson said he was vetoing the bank because he thought it was personally thought it was bad for the U.S. In other words, he is now vetoing not based on his constitutional belief, but on his belief about what makes a good policy. Why is that important? Because now he's using the veto in a way that gives the president equal power to 2/3 of Congress. So in order to undo a presidential veto, you need 2/3 of both houses. That makes the president as powerful as just under 2/3 of both houses of Congress together. That's an enormous leap for presidential power. The bank issue becomes what's known as the bank war, because it becomes a huge political issue in 1832. The country is split. Average people see Jackson using his veto power to protect the little guy. Easterners see him using his veto power as a kind of dictator. Henry Clay runs against Jackson in 1832 when Jackson runs for re-election. Clay gets walloped despite his support from Eastern banks. Clearly, there's a national mood behind Jackson. And what the framers feared about a popular demagogue, that is, a guy who appeals to the biases, prejudices, fears, and ignorance of the crowd in the street, has come true. That is how Jackson is winning this election in 1832. We don't have to worry about the Masonic Party here. So the election of 1832, he gets 219 of 49 electoral votes. We see his majority in both popular vote and electoral vote has gone way up. He's got all the regions of the country, he's got pretty strong support in. A little bit in Massachusetts and Connecticut, which were very heavy manufacturing states. You would expect they would back Clay. Henry Clay's home state of Kentucky goes for him. Again, you kind of expect that. But Jackson clearly has a mandate by a lot of people who don't understand what it means to get rid of that national bank. And so Jackson kills the bank early. He really uses his power as president to destroy the bank. You don't need to really know the details of this. You can look at this later if you want. Bank had been a stabilizing force in the economy. Jackson sets off a series of booms and busts without the stabilizing force of a national bank, the country starts to go into this cycle of booming economies, hugely booming economies, followed by complete bust-out depressions. Okay, the species circular and stuff, this gets really deep in the weeds. It'll be up on the slides if you really want to look at it. People who opposed Jackson's use of this veto power called him King Andrew. And this is the most famous cartoon. King Andrew I. Here you see him trampling the Constitution of the United States and holding his veto power like a weapon. And that's Andrew Jackson there. The opponents of Whig begin to get themselves organized, largely because of what he pulled in this 1832 election. And so the Whigs begin to coalesce as a party. The Whigs were progressive in that they supported government reforms. They were, again, that American system, that Hamiltonian thing. Canals, railroads, telegraph lines now are going to start to become a thing. They were for reforming society, using government power for the public good, reforming prisons, public schools. Had support from those educated, powerful elites, but also a lot of people, a lot of average folk, begin to look at, say, well, maybe these guys have a point. Maybe this is really going to help me. And so the Whigs become the other major party and the opposition to the Jacksonian Democrats. 1836, Martin Van Buren, who was Jackson's handpicked successor, had been his campaign manager, is elected president, so Jackson still has a hell of a lot of influence, and Van Buren takes over as president. The Whigs, although they had a lot going on, they couldn't sort of get united fast enough in the 1836 election to make a difference, and Van Buren wins with 51% of the vote, but that's enough to give him a good solid electoral vote count. And we see now those Whigs, that's the sort of this color here, or whatever this is, violet or something. You see they're picking up the Midwest, they're picking up some of the eastern states, yeah. This pink color is Daniel Webster, another Whig. He's up in Massachusetts. This purple color is White. He's another Whig, Georgia and Tennessee. So if you look at the popular vote, Van Buren wins barely the popular vote. He wins the electoral vote, but if you put all the Whigs together, you got a fair number in there, and they're going to become a party to be reckoned with after 1836. Okay, and we'll leave it there for the Jackson presidency.